How many of you have read even one of Bart Ehrman's many books? I know a few of you had. Okay, so I see a few hands out there. There's a lot more than is even up there. For the past 25 years, he's been doing something that most academics never quite manage, translating dense, nuanced academic scholarship into clear, compelling stories that people can connect with. He taught for decades at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but his larger classroom has long been the millions of readers that he's reached beyond it. At his best, Ehrman helps us see that the Christian scriptures are not something magically dropped down from heaven. I know I'm disabusing you all of that notion this morning, right? They are historical and literary documents shaped by real people. They are messy, human, alive. If you're looking for a way into the world of early Christianity, Ehrman's books are one of the best places to start. When I learned that he had a new book coming out, Love Thy Stranger, how the teachings of Jesus transformed the moral conscience of the West, I was intrigued. And if what you hear sparks your curiosity, I highly recommend the book itself. There is far more there than I can even begin to touch on this morning. So this Easter, I find myself less interested in debates over what did or didn't happen to Jesus' body after his death, and much more interested in what happened to the moral imagination of the people who followed him, because it sparked an ethical revolution that still asks something of us today. In fact, I want to suggest something that may be a little surprising to some of you, that the choice to place love at the center of our UU values and what that love demands of us owes more than we might expect to the life and teachings of the historical Jesus. Think about this for a moment. When you hear about a disaster, an earthquake, a wildfire, families displaced by war, most of us feel something. We feel a tug. We also feel a responsibility. Even if those suffering are people we have never met, in places we will never visit, for many of us that response feels like common sense. Of course we should help. Now, I wish a few more people in seats of power today felt, of course we should help, but most of us feel, of course we should help. But here's the unsettling part, that instinct to care about strangers, to feel responsible for them, for people completely outside of our closest inner circles, that is not something that human societies have always assumed historically. For most of human history, moral concern had much narrower boundaries. Care was expected for your family, for neighbors, for people who were, quote, like us. But the idea that you should extend that same concern to anyone, and moreover to the outsider, to the foreigner, to even to the enemy, that was far from obvious. And yet today, many of us, religious or not, it feels obvious. So the question is, where did that come from? It doesn't feel obvious to Elon Musk, but we can't get into that today. So the question is, where did that come from? Why does it feel like common sense to care about people outside of our tribe, to people we have never met? This is where Ehrman's argument begins to come into focus. He suggests that this widening of our circle of concern, it didn't happen gradually or accidentally. It was catalyzed by the teachings of Jesus. Not because Jesus invented compassion. Don't email me. I'm not saying that. But because he took existing moral traditions and he pushed them farther than they had ever gone before. He insisted that love was not just for your own people. It was for the stranger, for the outsider, even for the one who opposes you. And that idea took root, and it spread. And we are still living inside the consequences of that revolution today. Now, don't get me wrong. I've seen the bumper stickers, Jesus, save me from your followers, right? I'm not here to defend the terrible things that have been done in Jesus' name over the centuries and today. I would go further and say there are things that the historical Jesus said and did that I disagree with. That's why I'm a Unitarian minister and not a Christian minister. And keep in mind that Ehrman himself is a former Christian who now identifies as an atheist. But as a historian, he doesn't want us to miss some of the profoundly good things that came out of Jesus' life and teachings. To understand just how radical this shift was, we have to go back before Jesus to the ancient Greek and Roman world into which he was born. And here's what may be hard for some of us to imagine. At that time, religion was not primarily about how you treat other people. The connection between religion and everyday moral behavior, the idea that the gods cared how you treat others, was far less central than it is today. There were many gods. There were gods of the sea and the harvest, the home and the marketplace, the body and the weather. And the people worshiped the gods not to become morally good, but to make your life go well. You prayed, you made offerings, you honored the gods, and in return, you hoped they would give you health, protection, a good harvest, safe travel. Ancient Greco-Roman religion, in other words, was about maintaining a relationship with the divine so that your life here and now would hold together. And the gods, for the most part, were not especially concerned with your everyday ethics. Honestly, their everyday ethics, not great, if you go back and read the myths. They cared about whether you honored them properly, whether you made the right offerings, said the right prayers, showed the right devotions. But whether you insulted your neighbors, cheated someone in the marketplace, ignored someone in need, that really wasn't what the gods were focused on. That doesn't mean people in the ancient world didn't have ethics. They did. They loved their families, they helped their neighbors, they had quite strong moral codes. But if you wanted guidance over how to live a good life, you didn't typically turn to religion. You turned to philosophy. Before Jesus, ethical reflection was shaped by schools like the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Cynics, and these traditions were deeply concerned with how do I live a good life? But they approached that question in very different ways. The Epicureans emphasized minimizing pain and seeking simple joys, a life of steady, modest pleasure and inner peace. The Stoics held that true well-being comes from living in harmony with reason, and that rationality showed us that we need to accept that we have far more control over ourselves and our responses than we do over the world. And the Cynics took an even more radical path, detaching from social conventions and material attachments altogether, seeking freedom through radical self-sufficiency. What's important to notice is that all three of these are focused on how an individual lives a well-lived life, not on a broad moral obligation to care for strangers in need. For instance, Aristotle, writing more than 300 years before Jesus, he would not have agreed with the biblical teaching that comes from Leviticus originally and that Jesus lifted up as the second greatest commandment. This idea to love your neighbor as yourself, that's not Aristotle. He would have thought it virtuous to love your best friend as yourself. That difference is morally enormous because it defines the limits of moral concern, who is included and who is not. In other words, in the Greco-Roman world, moral concern had clear boundaries. It was directed toward family, friends, people in your own community, those who were in some meaningful sense your people. But beyond that boundary, moral obligation largely stopped. This idea that you owe something to a stranger, someone far away, someone outside of your circle entirely, that was just not part of the moral landscape. And there's one more piece we need to see clearly because it shapes everything else. Not only were moral obligations limited to your inner circle, there was also a widely shared assumption about how power works. In short, those who had power, they were expected to use that power over those who didn't. Empires were expected to conquer weaker people. Masters to rule over their slaves, fathers to hold absolute authority over their households, men to dominate women, and for the most part, that was not seen as a moral problem. It was simply how the world worked, that might made right. As the Greek historian Thucydides put it more than 2,400 years ago during the Peloponnesian War, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This way of seeing the world, it wasn't controversial. This was not debated. It was assumed. It was woven into everyday life, into politics, into family structures, into the very fabric of society. It wasn't seen as tragic. It was seen as realistic, how the world is. That was the moral baseline of the world into which Jesus entered. Again, this doesn't mean there was no kindness, no love, no care. There was, but it tended to flow toward family, toward friends, toward one's own people, and within a larger system where hierarchy and dominance were taken for granted. So if you take a step back and look at that world as a whole, you begin to see just how different its moral imagination was from our own. A world where ethical concern had clear boundaries, a world where power, not compassion, set the terms of what counted as right. And if we're honest, we can hear strong echoes of that worldview today in every White House press conference. Ironically, from some who claim to be most loudly to be followers of Jesus. Voices in the White House and the Pentagon that sound far closer to the ancient Greco-Roman logic of domination than to Jesus' call to love not only the stranger, but even one's enemies. To name just one example, at a recent Christian worship service at the Pentagon, totally fine, not a problem, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth joined in prayers asking for, quote, every round to hit its target, and for enemies were described as wicked and to be beat as fine as dust. Now, I don't always agree with the Pope, but in this case, Pope Leo got it right when he said that God, quote, does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war, but rejects those prayers. He went on to quote the prophet Isaiah, quote, even though you make many prayers, I will not listen, for your hands are filled with blood. Yeah, he's actually spitting fire quite a few times recently. If you go look at his Maundy Thursday address, I suspect he has a few things to say as well this Easter Sunday. We'll find out later. It's precisely this worldview of power, hierarchy, and domination that Jesus confronts. He's carrying forward the Hebrew prophetic tradition, just like Pope Leo is doing by quoting Isaiah. And what Jesus says does not tweak that worldview, it overturns it. In the Sermon on the Mount, he says, do not resist an evildoer. That's not what Hegseth said, right? Do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your cloak as well. Give your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go to 1 mile, go the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you. Do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Wall Street loves that one, right? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And here's the clincher. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If we had more time, I would love to explore how these teachings are not passive submission, but creative, nonviolent resistance that exposed injustice and reclaimed dignity in the face of oppression. Walter Wink's book, Jesus and Nonviolence, is an excellent, very short introduction if you want to learn more. But the essential point is this. Jesus was not giving advice for getting along. This is a demand, and it cuts against everything that was assumed to be normal. And Jesus makes it unmistakably clear, you will be judged by how you treat the least of these. Whether you feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, visit the sick and imprisoned. Likewise, in the parable of the Good Samaritan and in so many other places, Jesus takes the moral instincts already present in the Jewish tradition and he stretches them outward. Beyond tribe, beyond reciprocity, beyond the logic of us and them. This is the shift. This is what it means to put love at the center, not just expanding who we care about, but redefining what love itself requires. Not a feeling, but a practice. Not a preference, but a demand. A demand that crosses borders, social, political, personal. And if we're honest, that kind of love is not easy. If you think it's easy, you are not hearing me. It stretches us. It asks way more of us than most of us are often willing to give, much more than I am often willing to give. Just doing what a 2-year-old needs of me is often more than that's like too much, much less like every toddler on the block, like, or every person or whatever. Stretches us toward a radical vision of love that refuses to stop at the boundaries of who belongs. This isn't just about being kinder, it is about changing what we owe to one another. And then something happens. The movement that forms around Jesus doesn't stop at preserving his teachings. It begins slowly and unevenly to build those values into systems of care. Within a few centuries after Jesus' death, you begin to see something that the ancient world had never seen before. Institutions built, not for power, not for profit, not for prestige, but simply to care for those in need. Places where the sick could be treated, the poor could receive food, strangers could find shelters, what we would now call hospitals, orphanages, and emergency shelters. Today, we take these kind of nonprofit institutions for granted. They feel like common sense. Of course, a society should care for its most vulnerable. But in the ancient world, that was anything but obvious. In fact, the very idea of creating large-scale systems devoted to caring for strangers, people seen as having little to no economic or social value, would have struck many as at best unnecessary and at worst as some kind of madness. And yet within a few centuries of Jesus, these kinds of institutions begin to appear and then spread. Not perfectly, not purely, not without mixed motives or contradictions, but they do appear and they take hold. This is what I meant earlier, that placing love at the center of our UU values owes more than we might expect to Jesus. Now, we may have now secularized his ethic of love, transforming hope in the kingdom of God in a next world into building the beloved community right here and now in this life on this earth. But the changes that Jesus set in motion are a significant contribution to what made that shift possible. That paradigm shift is deeply connected to the Universalist half of our UU living tradition. Jesus universalized love, extending it to all without exception, not just widening the circle, but erasing the boundary. The philosopher Richard Rorty describes it this way. It turns out that willingness to endure suffering for the sake of a future reward like heaven, that is transferable. Like what motivated people to work for heaven, that is transferable from individual rewards to social ones, from one's hope for paradise to one's hope for one's grandchildren. As I used to say, as a Christian, I feel like I was taught to work out my salvation with fear and trembling. As a Unitarian Universalist, we're seeking to work out our salvation here and now with hope and trust. And that's all the difference in the world. I find the shift that Rorty's talking about deeply moving. We are called to love, not as fire insurance to save us from hell. Not to save ourselves, or to secure a place in heaven, but because putting love at the center of our lives, of our actions, of our social systems, helps create the better world that we want our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren to inherit. So this Easter, I'm not asking you to ignore the world historic harm done in Jesus' name over the past 2 millennia, crusades, Inquisition, violence against Jews, justifications for slavery, ongoing hatred and exclusion of our lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender siblings, carried out by people who are convinced they are doing God's will. We should not look away from that or try to explain it away. But I am asking you not to miss that the Christian tradition has also helped to inspire movements of care and compassion and service to those in need, shaping institutions and moral expectations that many of us take for granted that otherwise might not exist. No tradition, religious or otherwise, is purely good or purely harmful. These traditions are lived out by human beings, and we humans are capable of such extraordinary compassion and such extraordinary harm. The real question is not whether Christianity has been good or bad. History is so much more complicated than that. The real question is which parts of Christianity or any of the world's religions do we choose to carry forward, and which parts do we choose to resist as Unitarian Universalists? These questions are playing out in our own time. In recent months, we've seen it in the courage of ordinary Minnesotans standing up for their immigrant neighbors. As an Atlantic staff writer put it, if the Minnesota resistance had an overarching ideology, we could call it neighborism. A commitment to protecting the people around you, no matter who they are or where they came from. The contrast with the philosophy guiding the Trump administration could not be more extreme. Vice President Vance, who claims to be a Christian, I don't know if he's been tuning in to what the Pope has to say or not. I suspect he's like, la, 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 la. Vance has said, quote, "It is totally reasonable and acceptable for American citizens to look at their next-door neighbors and say, quote, I want to live next to people who I have something in common with. I don't want to live next to 4 families of strangers." But it turns out Jesus said, love thy stranger and neighbor. But Minnesotans are insisting that their neighbors are their neighbors, whether they were born in Minneapolis or Mogadishu. That is a deeply Christian philosophy, one apparently loathed by some of the most powerful alleged Christians in America. Standing up for justice in the streets of Minneapolis is what it looks like when love refuses to stop at the boundary of who allegedly belongs. Or as our own Unitarian Universalist Association said recently in a brief filed with the U.S. Supreme Court, a case that will help determine whether the turn-back policy at the Mexico border is lawful and will shape the future of our asylum system, quote, safeguarding the stranger is our moral responsibility. That is what it looks like when we take Jesus' radical love seriously. Why this matters to me is simple. I know that I live in a better world when I choose to care. And I want that better world, not just for myself, but for my son and for every one of us. The question is not whether love is a good idea. The question is, how far are we willing to let love reach? I don't pretend the answer is simple, but this is not just history. It is a choice we are facing every day. What began as a shift in moral imagination has become a question of moral responsibility. And that is the question that Easter leaves us with. Whether we will draw the circle small, protecting only those who look like us, think like us, belong like us. Whether we will let these billionaires take all the money, build compounds, and have robot guards, guarding them. A sermon in the fall coming on that. Or will we choose that wider, more demanding vision of love, one that reaches beyond fear, beyond tribe, beyond the boundary of who belongs? I'm grateful to be with you on that journey, to be part of this beloved community that challenges us always to do the hard work of siding with love. And as we continue to discern, how am I called? How are you called? How are we called in such a time as this to put love at the center?